Introduction to VertiGIS Studio Reporting, Chapter 2. In this chapter, we'll take a look at a VertiGIS Studio report and learn how it connects with data. We'll also learn about the basic building blocks, including bands and controls, and get to see a completed report. There's not a lab for this one for you to do on your own. Instead, it's just a demo that I will do. Let's start with what a VertiGIS Studio report is. A VertiGIS Studio report is really a collection of all kinds of data that is displayed in a single print-ready format, such as a PDF or an image. It can pull in data from multiple data sources and tell the whole story in just one report. The way that it works is we use the report tool to create the template that is going to be used once data is passed into it. So we use VertiGIS Studio Reporting to create the template that's ready to be passed values into it. Those values are going to be the selected features. So when your user runs the report from your app, it is the selected features that are going to get passed into the report, and then the template is going to be used to generate that PDF. Now we can hard code those parameter values. Instead of passing them in at runtime, we can hard code them, and then your report would run the same way every time. But how does the report talk to the data? Well, first, the report needs to know what data to talk to. It can be a web service or a database, but that data source needs to be established beforehand. As part of that, the report also needs to know what table it needs to talk to in that data source and what fields it needs in that table in that data source. Then it needs to know how to filter that data. So instead of running on all the features, it needs to know the specific features to include in the generated report. We use a query. It's behind the scenes when we get started, but it's a query that's used to essentially filter that data source. And if you've ever done any kind of database work, you know that to talk to a database, you tell it what table to connect to and how to connect to it, what fields to use, and then a where clause to filter what data is included. To establish a data source, this is something that's done in VertiGIS Studio Reporting, and that data source can be to spatial data such as an ArcGIS online feature service. It can be a map service. It can be a database like a SQL or Oracle database. It can be a file folder, maybe that has images in it. But anytime it needs to connect or talk to data, we have to establish the data source first. Now we're going to use a REST endpoint to talk to this data, to connect to it, but you can also add some local resources that you would use a local path to, provided you're using an on-premise install of VertiGIS Studio Reporting. The key to look for is that Data Sources tab on the taskbar. That's where you'll see all of the data sources that you've created. Then your report is going to use a query to determine which data to include in the report. So the report first needs to connect to the data and filter the data, and then in the report template itself is where you tell it which pieces of that data to show up where. Here in this picture, we're taking a look at down at the bottom. This is our report template, and you can see it's asking for things like the name and the zip and the area. That's all coming from the land use table. And then the other section down here with the tree name, the height, and the canopy, that's actually coming from a separate table in the same data source, separate table. It's coming from the park trees table. To filter the data, because we don't want it running on every park and every tree, we use a report parameter to filter the data. Essentially, parameters are prompted for, meaning that the app is going to pass these values into the report, and then the report will use that to filter the data and generate the report. And the good news is that if you're generating a report from a web app builder or a VertiGIS Studio web app or even a GeoCortex, a lot of that is built in already. So it's going to pass these parameters and populate the query for us without us having to do a whole lot of extra work. Now, when it comes to constructing the report, this is creating the report template. The report template consists of bands and controls. You can think of the bands as the building blocks of your report. They're essentially the chunks of the report that are going to get populated depending on what information is passed into the report. Now, each report has to always have these 3 bands. It has to have a top margin, a bottom margin, and a detail band. And we'll learn more about the bands as we get involved in class. The type of band, there's more than just those 3 types, by the way. There's several types of bands, but the type of band will determine where it shows up in the report and how often it gets repeated. Within a band is where we place controls. Controls are the actual information we want to appear in the report. So the bands, those are the building blocks that determine that chunk where it shows up in the report and how often it's repeated. And then the controls are what the bands contain. So the controls, there's several different types. You can have text controls or pictures or maps or page numbers and dates. The type of control will determine what kind of information it shows and what types of properties can be configured for it. All of the pieces that make up the report, all of the things you see, each one of those things is a control. And with a control, you would add it into your report, and then when it's selected, you would modify the properties of it to suit the needs of your report. Now, there are a lot of controls and there are a lot of properties that can be set for them. How to figure out what they are and how all those properties affect the report, you need to rely on the help documentation. And I have to say that the VertiGIS Studio Reporting help documentation is pretty good stuff. It's some of the best help documentation that I've seen. It will have all of those possible controls laid out alphabetically, and you can click on one of those controls in the list here and see a description of it, some tips on how to use it, and then all of the possible properties that you can set for it, what they are, what type of information they need, what the options are, and how they affect the control. So let's take a look at a completed report that I have, and we'll get to know some of the pieces for it. So here I have an example report inside of VertiGIS Studio Reporting. You can see over on the left-hand side of my design surface, these are all bands. Now these bands can be collapsed. If you click on it to select it, you can click again to collapse it, and then click again to expand it. So there's all types of bands here. Remember, the bands are the chunks of the report and they determine where it shows up in the report at the beginning, at the end, for instance, at the top of the page, at the bottom of the page. But it also, the type of band will determine how often it gets repeated. Repeat the contents of this band once for every feature that gets passed into it, or just do it one time at the start of the report. Inside of these bands, you'll find the controls. And if I click on any one of these controls, I can see the properties panel show up on the right. And so these are all the properties that I can configure for this particular control, for this selected control. It's broken down into groups of properties that are collapsible. And even inside of that, it has some expandable properties. And as you get to know reporting, you'll learn that you can dig way in to these properties. There's a lot of properties here that can be set up. To modify a property, just type in the value or choose the option that you want. And then the ones that are bolded, like this text alignment, see how it's bold, but the text trimming is not? If it's bold, it means, well, if it's bold with an expand arrow, it means that there's more in it than that. If there's not an expand arrow and it's bold, it means that property has been modified from the default. As I click through these different controls, you can see the options change. So the type of control determines what kinds of properties can be set. I will let you know too that the order that the properties appear in, that's not significant. Well, I guess it is significant. Sometimes VertiGIS Studio Reporting will reorder these guys so that the ones that you've modified are up at the top. So just know that during the course, as you're working through the labs, if you don't do it in the exact same order as the lab, or if you do part of it and then go check something else out and come back to it, the order that these properties appear in the list might change a little bit. Don't worry, you're not going crazy. It took me a while to figure out that I was not going crazy, that VertiGIS Studio Reporting was reordering them sometimes. Best I can figure is that the ones that you've modified go up to the top, but that's not always the case. So I mentioned these bands are the building blocks, and if I collapse some of them here, you'll see what I want to point out here is that this design mode, this design surface, is not really a print preview. Right? Depending on the data you feed into it, it might be pretty close, but these are just the guidelines, the building blocks of how to create that report from the template once data has been fed into it. I also wanted to point out here the help documentation. If you go to the taskbar, you can access the help documentation right from the Help tab. There's some shortcuts here. I like to go straight to the Getting Started. And in here, you'll see there is a book called Configure Controls. And if you click on that, down at the bottom of that group is a control reference. And if you open that one, these are all the types of controls in alphabetical order. We can click on any one of these controls and get the details about it. So usually the way this help is laid out is it tells you a little short sentence or two about what this control is. It gives you a description, more details about it, examples of when you would use it. And then some of the properties in that big properties panel, many of those properties are common between many of the controls. So rather than typing those out for each individual control, they've compiled those into a single list, and you can access this properties common to most controls. That will give you the details about the properties in this list. It's kind of nice because then there's only one place you need to go to get those particular details about those properties, and the information is consistent. It's the same no matter which control you start with. But then the properties that are specific to this type of control will be listed below that. And these headings that we see in here, those are going to match the headings in the properties panel. So here I'll look at a label control. I've got a description. Here's a link to the common properties. And then I've got the actions. I've got appearance. And so this will explain what the property is and what data type it's looking for, what kind of information. If there's certain options in there to choose from, it will explain what those options are. But these headings here are going to correspond to the headings in the actual properties page. So if I go to this label control, I'll see that here I have actions, styles, appearance. So those are the same headings that I see in the help documentation. I encourage you to keep that help documentation open, and as we start building our report, if there's a control that you want to know more information about, or if there's a specific property that you want to know more information about, don't forget to use that help documentation to look it up. Now, one more thing that I want to point out about this help documentation is that there are different versions of the help. So every time a new release comes out, the help gets updated. That's significant when you're using software as a service because you'll be running the latest and greatest version every time. We're running an on-premise version in class, and so we're a few versions behind the latest one, which is okay. Everything's still working in a similar manner. There's just maybe some new functionality that we won't be able to cover. But if you want the help for the particular version that you're working with, you can use that drop down. That's going to take us to the end of Chapter 2. In this chapter, we looked at a VertiGIS Studio report, got to know some of the pieces involved to creating it. We talked about how a VertiGIS Studio report talks to the data, and then it's the app that is going to pass in essentially how we're going to filter that data. The app is going to pass in some selected features, but then those object IDs are going to be used to filter the data when the report talks to it directly. We talked about how the bands are the building blocks of the report, and the type of band determine where it shows up and how often it gets repeated. Inside of those bands, we place the controls. The controls are what actually show up or show something on our final report. And we took a look at some of the components of a completed report.